The coffee was still hot. Just kidding. The first thing that happened was a sound. Not an alarm, more like a cough from the ship's old speaker system. A low, broken tone that meant something had come through on a long-range receiver. The kind of tone the steady hand made when it was trying its best. Neva looked up from her navigation screen. She had cold noodles in one hand and a stylus in the other, and the expression of someone who had been enjoying the silence and did not want it interrupted. "Petra," she said. "Already looking." Petra answered from across the corridor, not looking up from the heat management panel she had been arguing with for the past 2 hours. "It's a signal. I can hear that." Distress. That made Petra look up. The signal was not in any human language. The sounds coming through the speaker were hard and clipped, consonants that hit like small stones dropping on a metal floor. But wrapped around those sounds, in the universal format that every Concord-recognized species agreed on 300 years ago, was the shape of a cry for help. You did not need to understand the words. The rhythm of desperation was the same in every language. You just had to be paying attention. Neva set down her noodles. Donald came through the corridor, half a minute later. He moved the way he always moved, slowly, with purpose, like a man who had learned a long time ago that running only made things feel more dangerous than they were. He was a big man, heavy-set, with a face that looked like it had seen most things and decided to be calm about all of them. He read the signal data that Neva had already pulled up on the main screen. He did not say anything for a moment. "Drax 6, Neva said. "The ship designation matches a diplomatic registry. I ran it twice." "How far?" 40 minutes at current speed. "We can be there in 22 if we push." "What's their situation?" "Life support failure. Progressive. Their power core is still running, but systems are going dark in sequence." Neva paused. "Their atmosphere is holding for now, but the heat is dropping." Donald looked at the number in the corner of the screen. The Draxic ship had, at best, 3 hours. The nearest Concord vessel, the nearest anything with proper medical equipment and Draxic's trained staff, was 14 hours out. Neva had already looked. He knew her well enough to know she would have looked before he arrived. "Is anyone else closer than us?" he asked. "No." He nodded once. "Wake Rudy and Breck." Petra turned from her panel. "Donald, Drokvi. They're not going to, I know," he said. "They'll probably file a complaint with the Concord just for the fact that we touched their hull. Probably. They don't like us." "A lot of people don't like us," Donald said. "Set the course, Neva." Neva set the course. She ate the last of her cold noodles while she did it. Rudy came up from the lower deck with his medikit already in hand, because he had heard everything through the corridor vents and was the kind of man who started preparing before he was asked. He was tall and wide-shouldered, with a quiet voice that belonged on someone half his size. He read the signal data and said nothing except, "Do we know how many are aboard?" "Diplomatic registry lists a full delegation," Neva said. "But the signal is only broadcasting on one active frequency. I think most of their crew got to the emergency section." "Children?" Rudy asked. Neva checked. "The registry flags it as a clutch transit vessel." She paused. "That means I know what it means," Rudy said. Breck came up from the cargo hold, still pulling on his jacket, which was inside out, and with the expression of someone who had been deeply asleep and was now trying to look like he had not been. He was 19 years old. He had been on the steady hand for 8 months. He was not yet good at most things, but he was trying, which Donald valued more than people expected. "What's happening?" Breck asked. "We're going to help someone," Donald said. "Are they going to want help?" "Doesn't matter right now." Breck thought about that and decided it was probably true. He finished putting on his jacket the right way and went to his station. The Steady Hand was not a beautiful ship. It was a cargo hauler built for function, with a hull that had been patched in 14 places and an engine that made a sound on startup that the manual described as acceptable variance, and that Petra described as a slow death. But it moved when asked, and it was honest about what it was, which was more than could be said for a lot of things. When they reached the Drax-6 vessel, it was dark, running on minimal power, drifting slightly off its last registered heading. Large, much larger than the Steady Hand, and shaped the way Drax-6 ships always were, all angular planes and layer hull sections that looked like scales from distance. Now it looked like something that had tried very hard and was losing. docking took 11 minutes. The airlock systems were not compatible, and Petra had to hardcode a bridge connection that she would later say was the most stressful thing she had ever done and that she was never doing again. She did it perfectly. Donald led them through. The corridor inside was cold. Not the kind of cold that meant the heat was off, the kind that meant the heat had been off for a while. Their breath came out in small white clouds. The emergency lighting was amber, which made everything look like the inside of something old and sleeping. They found a crew. Most of them were conscious, but sitting still against the walls, conserving warmth. They looked at the humans the way most Draxics looked at humans, with a kind of stiff, controlled neutrality that meant something more complicated underneath. And then Rudy stepped through the door at the end of the corridor. He stopped. The others pressed in behind him and stopped too. The room was dim. In the center of it, on what might have been a ceremonial mat, a Draxix female lay on her side. She was large, even by Draxic standards, with deep bronze scales that had gone ashen at the edges with cold. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow. Around her, tucked against the curves of her body, were 6 creatures so small that Rudy's first thought was that he was looking at the wrong thing. They were the size of large cats, covered in soft, almost translucent scales that held the faintest glow, like light seen through thin paper. Each one was curled tight, their small heads resting on the female's side, their tiny claws hooked gently into her scales to hold on. Their chests rose and fell. Too fast, too faint, they were losing warmth. You could see it. The glow was going out of them slowly, the way embers go dark from the outside in. Rudy did not hesitate. He crossed the room and dropped to his knees. He put 2 fingers against the nearest hatchling's neck, tiny, barely there, and felt the pulse. Thin, uneven point. One of the small ones opened its eyes. They were gold, bright gold, enormous for its face, and they fixed on Rudy with the particular helpless directness of something very small that has run out of options and is looking at you because you are there. Rudy looked back, but he did not say anything for a moment. Then he looked over his shoulder at Donald. "We have to take them," he said. "Now, if they stay here, they'll die." Donald did not ask if he was sure. He could see the same thing Rudy could see. "Can we move them safely?" "We have to." Behind them, there was a sharp sound. Hard consonants, short. One of the Draxix crew had risen to his feet and was speaking with the kind of urgency that needed no translation. Donald held up one hand, open, the universal shape of not a threat. Then he pointed to the hatchlings. He put his hand over his own chest. He felt his heartbeat under his palm, and he held that position, hand over heart, and looked at the Draxix crew members steadily. There was a long silence. The clutch mother on the floor stirred. Her eyes opened, half-focused, amber and enormous. They moved across the room and found the humans. Her expression was unreadable, but she did not move to stop them. It was enough. Rudy picked up the first hatchling with both hands, tucked it against his chest, and felt it make a sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a breath, somewhere between the two. He felt its tiny claws find the fabric of his jacket. He stood up. "Let's go," he said. Nobody had a plan. That was the first thing Rudy understood as they carried the hatchlings through the docking corridor and back into the steady hand. They had no Drax-6 bonding cradles. No thermal regulation equipment calibrated for Velm biology. No reference guide for how to keep a 2-week-old dragon child alive when its mother was unconscious and its body temperature was sliding towards something that had a name in a medical textbook and not a good one. But what they had was themselves. Rudy had pulled the Drax-6 ship's medical database through the hardline connection while Petra was still bridging the airlocks. He had been reading fragments of it on his wrist unit the whole walk back, translating badly, filling gaps with logic and intuition and the particular focus calm that came over him when panic was not an option. He had read enough to understand the core problem. The Velm, Drax-6 hatchlings in their first 3 weeks of life, could not regulate their own body temperature. Their nervous systems were still finishing the work they had started in the egg. During deep sleep, especially, they needed a rhythmic external warmth. Not just heat, but a pulse. Something living. A beating heart, close enough to feel. Without it, their own rhythms would lose their anchor and begin to drift, and when they drifted far enough, they did not come back. The Drac 6 had bonding cradles for this purpose, precisely engineered to replicate the resonance of a Drac 6 heartbeat. They had none of those, but they had heartbeats. Rudy lay down first. He did not make a speech about it. He found the widest flat space in the cargo bay, a cleared section near the port wall, pulled a thermal blanket off the emergency shelf, and laid down on his back. He placed 2 of the hatchlings on his chest. They were limp and light, each one barely 3 kilograms, their small, glowing forms dim and cool to the touch. He pulled the blanket over them carefully, leaving their heads free, and put one large hand over them. Then he breathed slowly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way he had learned to breathe in the years after his daughter died, when sleep had been hard and mornings had been harder. The slow breath that steadied the heart, that kept it even. Under his hand, he felt the hatchlings shift. One small claw hooked into his shirt. "Okay," he said to no one in particular. "Okay." Donald came over and crouched beside him. "What do I do?" Rudy told him. Donald nodded, took one of the remaining hatchlings, a slightly larger one with faint ridge markings that would probably be magnificent in a few years, and lay down 4 feet away with it on his chest. He looked, Neva would later say, exactly like a man who had gone to take a nap and was very serious about it. Neva took one. She lay on her side, tucked it against her collarbone, and pulled her jacket around it. She stared at the ceiling of the cargo bay with the focused expression of someone doing hard, invisible work. Breck stood in the doorway for a moment. He was looking at the remaining hatchling in Rudy's arms, the smallest of the 6, a thin little creature with what would eventually be a silver undertone to its scales, but right now was just pale and faintly cool to the touch. Its eyes were closed. Its breathing was the shallowest of the 6. "That one?" Breck asked. "That one needs it most," Rudy said. Breck sat down cross-legged on the floor. Then he thought about it and lay down instead. He held his hands out, and Rudy placed the small hatchling against his chest. Breck made a sound that was not quite a word, pulled his arm up to cup around it, and was very still. That left Petra. Petra was standing near the cargo bay entrance with the last hatchling cradled against her like someone had handed her something valuable and she had not consented to it. She was a practical woman with practical opinions, and one of those opinions was that she was bad at soft things. She said this regularly. Nobody argued with her, because she was usually right. The hatchling in her arms turned its head and pressed its face against her neck, right against the pulse point. Petra closed her eyes. She sat down against the cargo bay wall, pulled her knees up slightly, settled the hatchling. The one with the faint soft curve at the tip of its emerging horn, the one Rudy had quietly started calling soft horn in his head, into the hollow of her throat and collarbone, and put one hand over it. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "You don't need to," Donald said from across the bay. "Just stay still." "I am still." "Then you're doing it right." For a while, there was no sound in the cargo bay except the low hum of the ship's engine, the acceptable variance that meant they were moving, and the quiet, separate rhythms of 5 people breathing slowly. Saraveth had been carried aboard by 2 of her own crew. She was conscious now, or close enough to it. She sat propped against the far wall of the cargo bay, wrapped in a thermal sheet, with her eyes open and her face doing the complex, controlled work of a Drac 6 who had feelings and was not going to discuss them. She watched. She said nothing. Her crew had not come aboard. There had been a long exchange in Drac 6 between her and the ranking male before she had let the humans bring her through the airlock. Donald did not know what had been said. He suspected it was the kind of agreement that cost her something. She watched Rudy's chest rise and fall with 2 of her children on it. She watched Breck humming under his breath, off-key, something without a name, and the smallest hatchling pressing more firmly against his heartbeat in response. She watched Petra sitting very straight and very still with her eyes closed and the most careful look on her face, like someone trying to keep something from tipping over. Her own heartbeat, Donald could see at her throat, visible in the amber light, was faster than it should have been. Rudy spoke without looking up. "They're warming," he said. "The 2 on me. I can feel it." Neva checked hers. "Same." One by one, across the cargo bay, the reports came in. The glow under the hatchling's scales was returning. Faint at first, then steadier like someone slowly turning up a lamp. Softhorn, last and smallest, took the longest. Petra sat without moving for 22 minutes, and then the hatchling against her neck made a sound. A tiny, low sound that was not quite a purr and not quite a sigh, but lived somewhere between the two, and its scales brightened. Petra let out a breath she had been holding for an unknowable amount of time. Across the bay, Saraveth made a sound too. It was barely audible. It was not a Drac-6 word that the translator caught. It was something older than words. The kind of sound that comes out of a mother when fear that has lived in the chest for hours finally unlocks its claws. Rudy heard it. He did not look up because he understood that she did not want to be looked at right then. He just kept his heartbeat slow and even and his hand steady over the two small lies sleeping on his chest. The ship moved through the dark. The engine hummed its acceptable hum. The cargo bay was warm. After a long time, Saraveth spoke. Her translator rendered it in the flat, approximate way it always did, shaving off the texture of what she actually said and leaving only the words. "Why does it not feel like shame?" she said to IT. It was not quite a question. It was not quite anything. It was just a thought that had gotten too heavy to carry alone and had slipped out. Nobody answered. There was nothing to answer. Rudy moved his thumb slightly over the scales of the sleeping hatchlings on his chest, and that was all. 14 hours is a long time to be still. The steady hand moved slowly. Not because it had to. It could have pushed harder, but because Rudy had asked and Donald had agreed, and the reason was simple: vibration. High-thrust travel put a tremor through the hull. Not much. Not enough for a human to notice. But the hatchlings were sensitive in ways that their database entries only partially described, and slow was safe, and safe was the only thing that mattered right now. So the ship moved at a pace that felt, to Neva, like being carried by something polite. They built a rotation. It was not elegant. It was not planned. It grew the way practical things grow, out of necessity in small conversations, and people figuring out what the person next to them needed before they had to ask. When Petra had to go check on the heat coupling that had been complaining since before the signal came in, Neva took Softhorn and added it to the one she was already holding, lying very flat and very still with two small glowing creatures arranged on her, like she was a shelf. When Donald had to be at the helm, Breck took the ridge-marked hatchling and held it with both arms, lying in the corridor just outside the cockpit door, so that Donald could hear him humming. Breck hummed constantly. It was not music in any organized sense. It was noise with rhythm, the kind of sound a person makes when they're doing something with their hands and not thinking about the sound they are making. But the hatchling on his chest, the one with the beginnings of a ridge along its spine that suggested it would be very large someday, had responded to it the first time Breck made the sound without realizing, and now it pressed against him whenever he stopped. S.O. Breck did not stop. "You're going to hum yourself to sleep," Neva told him during one of the rotations. "I'm not going to hum myself to sleep," Breck said. He hummed himself to sleep 40 minutes later. The hatchling adjusted, pressing harder against his chest, riding the long, slow rhythms of his sleeping breath. When Rudy came to check, he looked at the two of them, Breck flat on his back with his mouth slightly open, the hatchling tucked against his collarbone and glowing steadily, and decided not to wake him. Donald and Saraveth had their first real conversation in the third hour. He had brought her something to eat, a protein pack from the Steady Hand stores, which was not Drac-6 food by any definition, but had enough in it to be useful. She looked at it the way she looked at most things, carefully from behind a face built to give very little away. She ate it without comment. He sat against the wall a few feet from her and watched the cargo bay for a while. "You could have ignored the signal," she said eventually. Her translator gave the words a flat, even delivery, like reading from a document. Donald had been talking to Drac-6 long enough, in cargo ports, in transit stations, across customs counters, to hear the real shape of a sentence under its translation. Could have, he agreed. There is no legal requirement. The Concord Distress Protocol does not compel civilian vessels in this sector. Right. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you expect to receive? Donald looked across the cargo bay. Rudy was asleep now too, both hatchlings rising and falling with him. The whole bay had gone soft and dim and breathing in a way that made it feel less like a cargo hold and more like something else. Nothing, he said. We didn't expect anything. Saraveth's amber eyes moved to him. Donald had the impression of being examined by something very intelligent and very old, even though she was not old, not by Draxic standards. She had the eyes of something that had thought about most questions longer than he had been alive. That answer does not make sense, she said. I know, he said. I never figured out how to explain it, so it makes sense. She looked away. She was watching Petra, who had come back from the heat coupling and was now sitting against the opposite wall with Softhorn awake in her lap, poking at Petra's thumb with one tiny claw with the concentrated curiosity of something that had just discovered what thumbs were. Petra was watching it with an expression that she would have described as neutral, and that everyone else in the bay could see was something else entirely. That one is the weakest of the clutch, Saraveth said. Her voice did not change, but the way she said it, the weight of the words, was the weight of a fear that had lived in her for longer than the journey. It has always been the weakest. It's doing well now, Donald said. Saraveth did not answer for a long time. Then, yes, it is. In the 6th hour, Rudy woke and ate and went back to his spot in the bay. While he was eating, sitting cross-legged with the hatchlings handed temporarily to Neva, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, to no one in particular, and to Petra specifically because she was closest, my daughter used to do that. Petra looked up. Press her face against my neck when she was sleeping, he said, looking for the heartbeat. She was 6 weeks early. She spent the first month finding heartbeats. Made this sound when she found one. He stopped, sort of like the sound these ones make. Petra was still. She died at 4, he said. Cardiac. One of those things that doesn't announce itself ahead of time. He said this the way he said most difficult things, quietly, without armor, without asking for a particular response. I don't think about it the way I used to, but something about this. He gestured at the bay, at the sleeping hatchlings, at all of it. Something about this brought it up. Petra looked at the hatchling in her lap, still investigating her thumb. Is that why you were the first one to lie down? She asked. Rudy thought about it. Probably, he said. Across the bay, his hatchlings were with Neva, pressed against her sides, glowing steadily. One of them made a sound in its sleep, a low, resonant vibration that was not quite a snore but had the same comfortable energy. Neva looked down at it with an expression of someone who had been ambushed by something small and was not sure how they felt about it. In the 9th hour, the Concorde ship made contact. Neva took the call at the helm. The voice on the other end was clipped and official and belonged to a counsel named Vor, whose tone said he'd been briefed on the situation and was not pleased about any of it. He confirmed the Concorde vessel's ETA. He asked for a status report. He asked, twice, whether the humans had made any modifications to the diplomatic vessel without Draxic's authorization. Neva answered each question with the plain, exact facts. When the call ended, she sat for a moment. Then she went back to the cargo bay and told Donald what she had heard in Vor's voice underneath the official tone. The shape of it. The way questions like that were not really questions. Donald nodded slowly. He's already decided what happened, Neva said. Probably, Donald said. We'll deal with it when it gets here. In the 12th hour, Saraveth stood, slowly, still unsteady, but upright, and walked across the cargo bay on her own. She stopped in the center of it. The crew watched without making it obvious they were watching. She looked at each of her children in turn. Rumble, glowing like a banked fire on Breck's sleeping chest. The ridge marked one. Donald had taken to calling it bright in his head, warm and golden and radiant. Tiny Claws, who had spent most of the last 12 hours hooking its feet into Neva's jacket lining and holding on. Still one in pip sound, side by side on Rudy, breathing in near-perfect synchrony with him. And Softhorn, awake in Petra's lap, who looked up at its mother with huge gold eyes and made a small, soft sound. Saraveth looked at them all. Every one of them alive. Every one of them warm. She looked at the humans who were holding them. Then she did something that none of them expected. She sat down in the middle of the cargo bay floor, not against a wall, not at a distance, and folded her legs under her and stayed. Close enough that the hatchlings could see her. Close enough to be with them without asking to hold them yet. Close enough to be present. Nobody said anything that it felt like something had been decided. The Concorde ship was still 2 hours out when the first Veln woke fully. It was Softhorn. It sat up on Petra's knee, looked around the cargo bay with enormous gold eyes, saw its mother sitting in the middle of the floor, and made its sound, the small between the two sound that wasn't purring and wasn't sighing. Then it turned around and pressed its face back against Petra's throat. That Petra's hand came up without any decision behind it and covered the small creature's back that Serveth watched. The thing in her face was not readable by human standards. It was not supposed to be. But Donald, who had spent 30 years hauling cargo past the edges of what most humans considered familiar, had learned to watch for the things that weren't supposed to showed. He could see it. He looked away because she did not need to be seen seeing it. The steady hand moved through the dark. The engine hummed. The cargo bay was warm and quiet and full of small glowing things sleeping against human hearts. And in 2 hours, a diplomat was going to arrive with accusations fully prepared, and none of that had happened yet. For now, there was just this, and this was enough. Count Vor was the kind of person who arrived before he arrived. What that meant was, when his ship docked, when the airlock opened, when his footsteps came down the boarding corridor, all of it was only the last step in a process that had started much earlier. Neva had heard it in the call, the prepared tone, the questions that already had answers built into them, the specific way he had said modifications without authorization, not asking if they had happened, but positioning them as a fact that was already in the record, waiting to be confirmed. He stepped aboard the steady hand in the full formal uniform of a Concorde diplomatic council. Deep blue-gray, structured, a rank sigil at the collar that meant access to anywhere and authority over most things. He was Drax 6, old enough that his scales had deepened to near black at the ridge of his brow. He had the eyes of someone who had seen many things and filed them all correctly. His first look was at the cargo bay that he stood in the entrance for a moment. 6 hatchlings were visible, awake now, most of them, moving slowly around the cargo bay with the slightly unsteady quality of small creatures that had found their legs in the last hour. They were glowing steadily, all of them, bright and warm and healthy. One of them, the ridge-marked one, bright, was attempting to climb Donald's boot with focused determination. Davor's eyes moved from the hatchlings to the humans. He took in the thermal blankets, the cleared floor space, the way the cargo bay had been rearranged into something soft and practical and lived in. His face did not change. His first words were, "Where is the clutch, mother?" Serveth stepped forward from the inner wall. She was upright and steady now, a different presence than she had been 14 hours ago on the floor of a cold, dark ship. She inclined her head to Vor at the exact angle that the situation required, respectful of rank, not diminished by it. "Council," she said. "Hi, mother." His eyes moved over her. "You appear to be in good health. I am recovered." And the clutch. As you can see, Vor looked at the cargo bay again. Something in his posture said he did not like what he saw, but the words he chose were careful. "I will need to conduct a full examination of the hatchlings before transfer. Standard protocol following an unscheduled handling event." The phrase he used, unscheduled handling event, was the kind of phrase that had a shape like a neutral description but a weight like a judgment. Rudy spoke from across the bay. He was sitting against the wall with Still One and Pip Sound in his lap. Both awake, both leaning against him like he was a comfortable piece of furniture they had claimed. "2 of them are still in the stabilization window," he said. "The vascular resonance isn't fully established yet. Moving them to a cold examination environment right now. I did not ask for a medical assessment from a cargo medic," Vor said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Rudy looked at him with the particular calm of a man who had been in difficult conversations before and had learned that quiet was a better tool than anger. "You have it anyway," he said. Vor turned to Donald. "Captain, I need to understand the sequence of events that led to your crew handling Drax 6 diplomatic personnel and biological charges without authorization." "There was an authorization," Donald said. "The High Mother's crew allowed us aboard. She allowed us to bring the hatchlings. She was non-responsive at the time of the transfer. She was conscious when we carried her through the airlock. She was not in a state to provide informed diplomatic consent." Vor's voice stayed level, which means the handling of the biological charges, the Veln, falls under Concorde Article 7, subparagraph 14, which covers civilian interference with protected species under Concord Diplomatic Registry. Breck had been quiet this whole time, sitting in the corner with Rumble in his arms. Rumble was awake and looking at Vor with the large, interested eyes of something that did not yet understand that some situations were tense. Breck spoke without looking up from it. What happens under that article? Formal inquiry, Vor said. Potential sanction. Suspension of trading license pending investigation. He paused. At minimum. Nobody moved. Rudy's hatchlings shifted in his lap. He put one hand on them without looking down. Vor turned back to Saraveth. Hi, Mother. I am prepared to transfer the clutch to proper Drac 6 care immediately. A medical officer is standing by aboard my vessel. The appropriate equipment. No. The word came out of Saraveth with a quietness that somehow had more weight than volume. Fo stopped. Counsel, she said. The hatchlings are stable. They are warm. They're where they need to be. With respect, Hi, Mother, proper Drac 6 bonding. 2 of them are still anchored, she said. Her voice did not rise, but it had the quality of something that did not intend to be moved. The medic is correct. The vascular resonance is not yet fixed. If you pull them from the warm source before it is established, you may not lose them today, but you may lose them next week, or the week after, or they may carry the instability their whole lives. She looked at Rudy briefly. He knows this. He told me. Ver looked at Rudy with an expression that had too many things in it to parse quickly. I translated what I could from your ship's medical database, Rudy said. Evenly. No challenge in it. I could be wrong, but if there's any chance I'm right, it seemed worth mentioning. Fo was quiet. He was not the kind of person who made decisions in front of other people if he could help it. But he was also, underneath everything, not a fool. His eyes moved to the hatchlings again, to the way they were sitting, calm, warm, glowing steadily, pressing themselves against the humans who were holding them with the unself-conscious trust of things that had decided. Then Breck did the thing. Nobody asked him to. No one would have thought to ask him to. Breck was 19 and impulsive and acted before he had finished thinking, which was usually a problem and was sometimes exactly the right thing. He sat down on the cargo bay floor with Rumble against his chest. Not standing, not waiting, not performing anything. He just sat down with the hatchling and looked at Vor with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had not yet learned that some stances required permission. I'm not moving until he's ready, Breck said. Vor stared at him. You can file whatever you need to file, Breck said. Write whatever you want. But I'm not moving. Neva crossed the cargo bay and sat down beside him. She had tiny claws with her, hooked into her jacket sleeve, as usual, and she did not say anything. She just sat down next to Breck, then Petra, then Rudy, then, last of all, Donald, who sat down at the end of the line, crossed his arms, and looked at Vor with the expression of a man who had decided and was comfortable with the decision. The entire crew of the Steady Hand was sitting on the cargo bay floor. Vor looked at them. He looked at Saraveth. Something was happening in his face that his face was not entirely successful at concealing. Saraveth looked at her children. At Rumble pressed against Breck's chest. At Softhorn, who had crossed the cargo bay floor on its own small legs and was now standing next to Petra, pressing its soft-horned head against her knee, looking up at Vor with enormous, unconcerned eyes. Saraveth made a decision. She knew it would cost her something. There would be conversations and questions, in Vor's carefully worded report, and the particular quiet judgment of her peers who had not been in a cold, dark ship with their children going dark. She would carry those costs. She had carried heavier ones. She lifted her head. Counsel Vor, she said. I invoke the clutch bond right. Vor went very still. I name these 5 individuals as guardians of this clutch. By the Drac 6 right of carried warmth. She looked at the humans on the floor one by one, and her voice did not waver. They have held my children through the dark. I name them. The naming stands. The cargo bay was very quiet. Where had gone the color that Drac 6 went when something had happened that would require a great deal of very careful paperwork. On the floor, Breck looked at Neva. Neva looked at Rudy. Rudy looked at Donald. Donald looked at Saraveth, and something in his face was open in a way that it usually wasn't. She met his eyes. She was not going to explain herself. The right had been spoken. That was the whole of it. Rumble made a sound against Breck's chest. Comfortable. Settled. The sound of something that was exactly where it was supposed to be. Vor picked up his communication device. He was going to need more forms. 3 days later, the neutral station smelled like recycled air and old decisions. Station Harith was one of the Concorde's administrative hubs. A large, efficient, deeply unromantic place built at the intersection of 4 major trade corridors because the intersection made sense, not because anyone would have chosen to be there otherwise. It had 17 docking arms, a formal inquiry chamber with seating for 40, and a cafeteria that served food from 11 different species and did all of them approximately equal disservice. The crew of the Steady Hand had been assigned quarters on level 7. Politely, they had been told, as a courtesy, pending inquiry. The door to their section locked from the outside at night, which was the kind of courtesy that was also something else. The hatchlings were healthy, fully stabilized, all 6 of them, glowing bright and steady and growing more confident in their legs every hour. They had been moved to the official Drac 6 diplomatic suite on level 4, where proper equipment had finally arrived. Sarah Veth was with them. The crew had said their goodbyes. Not permanent goodbyes, but the specific goodbyes of people who did not know what the next 3 days held and were not going to pretend otherwise. Rumble had not wanted to let go of Breck. That was the truth of it. When the transfer was made, Rumble had tightened its small claws into Breck's jacket and made a sound that nobody had heard it make before, a low, distressed vibration that the Drac 6 handlers recognized and responded to with calm efficiency. One of them had said something about resonance, imprinting, and typical temporary bonding behavior, and how it would resolve. Breck had nodded and let them take it. He had been very quiet for the rest of that day. The inquiry chamber held 40 seats. On the day of the formal proceeding, most of them were full. Word had traveled. It traveled the way things traveled on stations like Harith, not through official broadcasts, not through news, but through the secondary networks. Engineers talking to engineers. Medical staff comparing notes. Cargo handlers who had seen the Steady Hands docking log and asked around. An incident report had circulated in a format that was supposed to be internal and had stopped being internal approximately 6 hours after it was filed. The incident report included footage. The Steady Hands internal camera log, pulled as part of the formal evidence package. It showed everything. The cargo bay, the cleared floor, the crew lying down, one by one, with small glowing creatures on their chests. 14 hours of it. People sleeping, breathing, humming badly, eating quickly, going still again. No drama, no performance, just steadiness. The footage had been viewed, by the time the inquiry convened, by approximately 900 people across 4 stations and 2 vessels in transit range of the Concorde Relay Network. Nobody had asked them to watch it. They had just watched it. Councel Vor sat at the front of the chamber, flanked by 2 other Concorde officials. He had his prepare materials. He had his Article 7 filing. He had, Donnell suspected, a great deal of careful language built up in careful order, ready to be read into the record. Donnell sat at the table for the inquiry subject party. His crew sat with him. They had been given a legal advocate, a Concorde-assigned representative, a small Vethri named Sewell who had reviewed their case in 2 hours and told them plainly that the Article 7 charge was technically possible but practically difficult, and that the clutch bond invocation had complicated things considerably, and that she had never worked a case with this specific combination of factors before and found it genuinely interesting. Donnell had liked her immediately. The proceedings ran in the formal Concorde format: statement of incident, statement of responding party, statement to witnesses. Vor's presentation was everything Donnell had expected: precise, thorough, built to reach a conclusion it appeared not to have already reached. He laid out the sequence of events. He cited the articles. He used the phrase unscheduled intervention in a protected biological event 3 times, and each time it landed like a slow, heavy door closing. Then Donnell's turned. He did not prepare remarks. He had thought about it and decided that prepared remarks were the kind of thing that had a shape to them, and that shape was never quite right for the actual room. He sat at the table with his hands folded and told the inquiry what had happened. That he said, there was a signal, and they were the only ones close enough to answer, and they answered it. He said, The hatchlings were cold and losing warmth, and there was no equipment, and so they used what they had. He said he had not thought of it as a difficult choice. He said he still did not. Vor asked with controlled precision, "What did you expect in return?" Donald said, "Nothing." Vor asked again in a different construction. Surely some consideration was anticipated. Future trade access, diplomatic goodwill, reputation within the Concord network. "No," Donald said. "You acted without any expectation of reciprocal benefit." Donald looked at him for a moment. "The hatchlings were dying," he said. "We were there. We stopped it. That's the whole thing." A sound ran through the chamber. Not words, just the ambient shift of 40 people registering something. Vor pivoted. He called Rudy to give testimony on the medical decisions. Rudy gave it precisely, clearly, and at greater length than was comfortable for Vor, because the precision of Rudy's account made every decision sound not just defensible, but obviously correct. When Vor suggested that a certified Draxic specialist should have been contacted before intervention, Rudy agreed and added that the nearest one had been 14 hours away and the hatchlings had 3. Vor called Neva, who gave a navigational and timing data without embellishment. He did not call Breck, probably because Breck looked too young and too earnest, and the risk of him saying something guileless and devastating was too high. Then Saraveth gave her testimony. She spoke for longer than any of them. She did not speak to Vor or to the inquiry. She spoke to the room. Her translator rendered it imperfectly, as it always did, but the imperfection did not matter. The room had the footage. They had seen the cargo bay. They had watched the slow, quiet hours. She said that she had woken in a place that was not her ship, held by people who were not her kind, and the first thing she had seen was her children sleeping, breathing, glowing warm, held by hands that had no reason to hold them except that they were there and they needed holding. She said she had not had a frame for it. She said she had spent 3 days since trying to build one, and she was still building. She said, "There's a concept in Draxix culture for the one who stand in the cold between the danger and the young. The word does not translate precisely. It is not hero. It is not guardian. It is something older, something that is a choice and a nature at the same time." She paused. "I did not know that humans had the same thing. I did not know it could look the way it looks on them. Ordinary, unhurried, as if it required no decision. As if warmth were simply what they did." The chamber was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that is going to stay. Vor filed his formal assessment at the end of the session. Technical acquittal, no violation under Article 7, could be sustained given the emergency conditions, the clutch bond invocation, and the established positive outcome for the protected biological charges. He filed it with the professional precision of someone doing a job that was no longer going in the direction he had expected. Sewell shook Donald's hand outside the chamber. She told him it was the most interesting case she had ever worked, said it twice, and looked like she meant it both times. That a young Draxix observer stopped Rudy in the corridor. She was young enough that her scales still had the bright, unweathered quality of someone who had not been outside for long. She looked at him the way people looked at something they were trying to categorize and couldn't. "Is it true," she asked, "that humans do this? Care for things that are not their own? Do it without deciding to, just as a thing that happens?" Rudy thought about the question. He thought about Breck humming, about Petra sitting straight and still for 22 minutes until a heartbeat settled, about Donald lying on a cargo bay floor in the dark because small things needed him to be still. "Yeah," he said, "I think that might just be what we are." The young Draxix held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked past him down the corridor, and he had the sense that she was already turning something over in her mind, something large and slow and important that he left her to it. The inquiry closed on a Tuesday, which was a human measurement of time that the Concord did not use and that Neva tracked anyway, because she had grown up in a place with Tuesdays and she saw no reason to stop now. The formal outcome was 7 words in the official record: "No violation established. Parties free to depart." Vor had filed the words without ceremony and departed through a different airlock than the one the steady hand crew was using, which said everything it needed to say about how he felt about the result. Sewell sent a message the next morning that said, "Genuinely the most interesting case of my career. If you ever need a Concord legal advocate again, contact me first. I will come at reduced rate for the novelty of it. Donald wrote back, hope we won't need you, but thank you. The farewell was in the level 4 diplomatic suite, in the morning, in a room that had good light and enough space for 6 very active hatchlings who had been healthy and energetic and opinionated for 3 days and were fully prepared to demonstrate all of these qualities. Rumble saw Breck come through the door and cross the room at a speed that was impressive for something with legs that short. It hit Breck somewhere around the knee and made the sound, the big, resonant humming vibration that Breck had named it for in his own head on the first night. Breck went down to his knees and got the full weight of a now 3-kilogram hatchling pressed against his chest, and he made a sound that was absolutely not crying and that everyone in the room politely did not acknowledge. Bright eyes climbed Donald immediately, using the same route up his jacket that it had been practicing for 3 days, and sat on his shoulder with the satisfied look of something that had identified the best possible vantage point and claimed it. Tiny Claus was in Neva's jacket pocket, where it had apparently decided to live, and was looking out of the pocket with bright, interested eyes at the room. Still One pressed itself against Rudy's leg and stayed there without moving, which was why they called it Still One. Pip's sound made its sound, the short, bright vocalization that was the first thing it did whenever it saw something it recognized, and bumped its head against Petra's hand, and then did it again and again, the way it had learned that Petra would eventually put her hand on its back if it asked enough times. Petra put her hand on its back. Softhorn stood in the middle of the room and looked at Petra with those enormous gold eyes, and then walked toward her with the slightly deliberate steps of something that knew what it wanted and had decided to get it. It pressed its soft curved horn against her palm and held still. Petra did not move away. She had stopped moving away from small things in the last 4 days, and she had not yet decided what to do with that fact about herself. Saraveth stood near the window. She was watching all of it, the chaos of 6 hatchlings and 5 humans, and the morning light on the station hull outside, with the look of someone who had arrived somewhere she did not expect to arrive and was taking stock. She had called them into the room for the formal part of the farewell. But now that they were here, the formal part seemed like a different thing than it had when she planned it. She reached into the case on the table beside her and took out 6 small carved pieces, flat, oval, deep bronze in color, each one with a sigil worked into the surface that was fine enough that it must have taken a long time. The clutch seal. She had made them herself these past 3 days, working in the mornings before the rest of the suite was awake. She had not told anyone she was making them. She just made them. She put one in each human hand. Donald turned his over. The sigil was a simple form, 2 shapes, one within the other, the inner one smaller. He did not know the language, but Saraveth told him. The outer shape was the Drac 6 word for clutch. The inner shape was the word for held. This seal is recognized in any system where my name carries standing, she said. It identifies the bearer as kin guardian to my brood. It is not a diplomatic instrument. It is not a trade token. It is not a credential. She paused. It is a fact. She said, what you have done has a name in my language. I could translate it for you, but the translation loses most of the weight. What means plainly, you stood in the cold between the danger and the young. You did it for young that were not your own. You did it as if it required nothing, as if warmth were simply the thing you had, and so you gave it. She looked at them one by one. I did not know how to repay it. I have thought about this, and I think the truth is that it is not repayable. The right name's you guardians because the language needed a name for what you are, and that is the closest word. But what you are is something older than the word. Breck, who had rumble pressed against his chest and was holding it in the particular way it had taught him that it liked to be held, said nothing. His expression was the expression of someone who had just understood something they were going to think about for the rest of their life. Rudy held his clutch seal in his palm and looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded his hand over it and kept it. Neva pocketed hers with the smooth efficiency of someone maintaining composure, which she absolutely was. Petra held hers and looked at Softhorn, who was still pressed against her palm with its eyes half closed, doing the between purring and sighing sound. She thought about the 22 minutes in the cargo bay. The way she had said, I don't know what I'm doing. The way Donald had said, you don't need to, just stay still. She thought about how easy it had been in the end. Not difficult, not heroic, just staying still while something small needed her to. She was not. She had always said, good soft things. She was revising that. The hatchlings were taken from the crew one at a time, gently, by the Drax-6 handlers. Not forced, not pulled, but lifted carefully and carried to their mother, who received them against her side with the careful ease of someone who had been waiting for this and was not rushing it. One by one, the small warm shapes settled against her. One by one, the glow of them merged into a single quiet light. Last was Softhorn. It turned its head against Petra's palm, looked at her. Then it reached out one tiny claw and pressed it against the pulse point at her wrist, pressed it the way Rudy's daughter had pressed her face against his neck looking for the heartbeat, and held it there for 3 seconds. Then it let the handler carry it to its mother. Petra stood with her wrist still raised and her hand open. She stayed like that for a moment. Then she put her hand down and picked up her kit bag and shouldered it. "Ready?" Donald asked. "Yeah," she said. They left. The steady hand departed from docking arm 9 at mid-morning. Neva filed the departure log. Petra argued with the heat coupling, which had been fine for the last 4 days, and was now choosing this specific moment to express concerns. Rudy made tea. Breck fell asleep in the correct bunk for once, with one hand still closed loosely around the clutch seal. The footage, by then, had spread further than anyone had tracked. Vor's report existed, technically accurate and emotionally empty, in 3 official Concord archives where it would remain correctly filed and almost entirely unread. What was being read, watched, really and rewatched in ships and stations and administrative hubs, and a dozen places where people sat with something they were trying to understand, was the cargo bay. The footage. 14 hours of ordinary people lying still in the dark for small things that were not their own. It did not announce itself as remarkable. That was the thing that people kept noting. There was no speech, no declared intention, no visible choice. There was just the first person lying down, and then the second, and then the others, quiet, unremarkable, arranged around 6 small lives like something natural, like water finding level. Far from Harith, past the range of the standard relay network, a Kethari commander named Rova sat in her personal quarters aboard a patrol vessel and watched the footage on a secondary screen. She was a compact, precise person with a service record that said she was good at her work, and she had been told, in briefings, in cultural orientation sessions, in the casual opinions of colleagues who had dealt with Concord newcomers, that humans were soft. Death world biology with death world toughness, but emotionally uncontrolled, sentimentally excessive, prone to attachment that compromised decision-making. She watched a large, plain man lie down in a cold cargo bay and place 2 small alien creatures on his chest and breathe slowly for 14 hours. She watched a young male, barely adult by human standards, sit on the floor and say, "I am not moving," until he is ready with the simple certainty of someone who had weighed the consequences and decided they did not change anything. She watched a woman sit rigid and still for 22 minutes with a failing hatchling at her throat, not moving, not flinching, just staying there and being warm until it was enough. Rova had been told humans were soft. She pulled up the Concord's uncontacted species registry and opened the file she had glanced at twice before and never read carefully. The one about the 3rd planet of an unremarkable star in a sector that most of the Concord considered a backwater. The one she had passed over because the threat assessment metrics were high and the diplomatic utility assessment was low, and there did not seem to be a reason to look closer. She started reading it differently than she had before. In the Drax-6 diplomatic suite on Station Harith, 6 hatchlings slept against their mother in the good morning light. Their scales glowed steadily. All of them, even Softhorn, even Still One who had always been the quietest. The light from them was warm and even, and it filled the room like something that was glad to be there. One of them, Rumble, who had pressed against a human heartbeat for 14 hours in a cold cargo bay and had not forgotten the rhythm of it, made a sound in its sleep, low and comfortable, the sound of something that knew it was held. It was held. Everything else was just everything else.